I agree with the former Attorney General, basically because that is what the judge is doing. He's saying that the U.S. government is going through tremendous amounts of data and analyzing it. That's not what's happening. In reality, what happens is if the NSA gets an al-Qaeda member's cell phone from overseas, they plug in that cell phone number into the database, and then they can see which numbers here in America called it. And then if they want to wiretap those phone numbers, and at that point they don't even know the identities, they still have to go through a judge and get a warrant for that. So I think that the judge is misunderstanding exactly what's happening, but I will grant him this, which is that if he wants to make the argument, and I think that this is the strongest argument on the other side, that this is the seizure of a massive amount of property, and this property is in the hands of businesses, and the government can't come in and take it, then if that's the argument you want to take, then you have to go after the entire national security collection program over the past several decades, because there's these things called national security letters where the government can come in and retrieve the records of a business and use that for criminal investigation purposes. And there's some people that are uncomfortable with that because it's the government basically coming in and saying to a business, we want your records, and in most cases you're not allowed to tell anyone that we took it. But that's a bigger debate than what this NSA issue is about.
In general, the NSA story has, I've seen political opportunism taking a grain of truth and sometimes let's say a big section of truth and fact, but also blowing it up into the speculation that it's being abused or elements of it have been abused. And I see that more as a reflection of the current administration and the lack of trust in light of the numerous scandals. Not politicizing it, I'm saying the environment is ripe to say, well, we just don't know because look what's happening over here and over here. True or not?
I think that's true. I think that is the environment that we live in, where there's just very high cynicism towards government, and so it becomes easy to believe these exaggerations of what the NSA is doing. But if we were to just boil it down to the facts that we absolutely know, that would really enhance the argument, and that would help the country as a whole. If the argument was about the ability of the NSA and the federal government to come in and take the private records of businesses and confiscate them for investigation purposes, then that's an argument that the country can and should have. But when we're dealing with a debate about what the NSA is doing, where you have so many people that are misled into thinking that the NSA is storing all of our phone calls and emails and just going through all of them looking for terrorists, that just clouds the debate, and that doesn't advance anything.
Amen. Can't say it any better myself, so we'll move forward. I'm going to drop the Snowden just right now because I want to get to two of your great works, and I want to begin actually with a topic that leads to it, and that, of course, is the Wichita bomber, the person who was attempting to commit an act of jihad, as he called it. He is Terry Lee Lowen, and he has been radicalized in the United States. Father, living in Kansas, and what he wanted to do was commit an act of jihad. In his statements, he said he is following true Islam. My question to you is, when we have somebody like Lowen, thank heavens he was stopped, but he starts speaking to the doctrine of Islam and says jihad is part of it, a mandatory part from Muslims. Is he right?
I think that according to mainstream Islamic doctrine, it definitely is. And I think that any argument that is based on the idea that jihad is not part of Islam, when jihad is in and of itself an Islamic term, I think is going to fall flat. So the trouble that the reformist Muslims have in changing the interpretation of jihad is that they have to accept that jihad is part of Islam, but what the argument they have to make is that there is no reason for a violent jihad or any type of civilizational jihad against the West, that the West is not your enemy, and that, like many religions and philosophies, Islam has a doctrine of warfare, but the modern interpretation of Islam should not be that means waging war at all times for forever until the whole world's under Sharia.
And what that does, in essence, is it takes away political Islam as we know it.
Exactly. That's the fundamental debate right now that's happening within the Muslim world, which is about political Islam. Is Islam a political doctrine? If it is, to what extent? How do you reconcile that with modernity and Western forms of governance? All of that big debate is happening in the Muslim world, and we're not sure where it's going to lead to. But two important facts from the Wichita case that I think needs to be mentioned. The first is that this was a white convert that was 58 years old. Goes completely against the general profile of a terrorist recruit of someone that's Middle Eastern, that's not white, that's in their teenagers or in their early 20s. So that's interesting in and of itself. But secondly, when he was talking to the undercover FBI operative, he wasn't talking about, oh, well, I need to get U.S. troops out of Saudi Arabia or avenge the deaths of Iraqis or whatever. He said, look, my overall obligation, according to my beliefs, is to implement Sharia around the entire globe. And it's important that we seize upon these quotes, that we understand the mindset here. It's not really about politics.
Absolutely. And again, this relates to your coverage of a new poll of Muslim countries that found large support for terrorists. What poll is this, and what exactly do you mean by large support?
Well, what this latest Pew poll found is that there's still double-digit support for Hamas, Hezbollah, the Taliban, and most frighteningly, Al-Qaeda in the Muslim world. They surveyed 11 Muslim countries. All of them get double-digit support. Their support has fallen since 9/11, but it's still frighteningly high, especially for Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda goes so far as to massacre Muslims, yet they still get double-digit support. And so that's very frightening. The positive trend is that what we're seeing is a greater level of concern about Islamic extremism throughout the Muslim world, decreasing support for these terrorist groups. But then in Turkey, that's where the trend is being reversed. And in Turkey, support for suicide bombing has more than doubled in the past 2 years. So there's some good news and then some very bad news in this poll.
Why are we seeing these trends?
I think a lot of it has to do with the failure of political Islam. I think the idea before these groups really got examined was that, oh, well, they're liberation forces fighting against the Israelis and the American oppressors. And since 9/11, a lot of these groups have turned on other Muslims. Some of them have come to power and have failed miserably. And so they've really been exposed, and that's been good for the United States. But then you see in Turkey, which is a member of NATO, support for suicide bombing increasing, while at the same time the overall support for individual terrorist groups is low. So it's hard to figure out exactly what's going on here, but I think that the big takeaway is that about 1/4 in each of the surveyed Muslim countries, about 1/4 of the population didn't know if they supported or rejected these individual terrorist groups. So that means there's about 1/4 that are still up for grabs in the war for the hearts and minds.
Only if you're tough with America and adopt an anti-American stance will the U.S. have a more flexible attitude and pay you. That coming from an Egyptian official. What does that mean? How does that translate? That is, the more anti-American you are, the more support America will give you?
Yes, yeah, and can you blame the Muslim world for thinking that way? That's a quote from an Egyptian official all the way back in 2010. There's other officials from Jordan and other countries that were saying similar things. So this isn't a recent development. It only culminated into dramatic effect in recent months. And so you have Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and other American allies, even if I don't like everything that they do, but geopolitically speaking, they're allies, moving over towards Russia. And so you have the Middle East being divided between these different competing blocs, and they're competing for the favor of Russia, not of the United States, but of Russia. Because
give me the three
even if
blocks.
they hate Russia, at the end of the day, they know Russia is reliable.
Give me the 3 blocks, and normally I'd spend an entire segment with you on this, but I'm going to post the article with your permission because it was just simply outstanding. The 3 blocks, the breakdown right now we see in the Middle East, North Africa overall. Go.
The 3 blocks, well, the first one is led by Turkey, and that consists of the country of Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood. That's like the Sunni end of political Islam. And so that's the first block. The second block is led by Iran, and that includes Hezbollah, the Syrian dictatorship, and Iraq. That's the Shiites, the radical Shiites. The third block are the monarchies like Saudi Arabia and then also the Egyptian government, governments that hate both Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood, even if they make their own contributions to radical Islam. But this third block, the Saudis, the Egyptians, and the other Gulf countries, is actually the one that's the closest to Israel right now, because they see that Israel,
yes,
more than the other countries in the region, understand the threat from Iran and the threat from the Muslim Brotherhood. And so Saudi Arabia, even though everything about Saudi Arabia is diametrically opposed to what Israel stands for, is actually getting closer to the Jewish state. And so we're seeing a remarkable shift here in the Middle East.
Absolutely.